Hi guys, welcome back. We are doing another lecture today. I'm doing it through Zoom, so I should be able to share my screen and you'll be able to see me. So best of both worlds, right? Hopefully this works here. All right. So we're covering there we go. Magic. We're covering the second half of the Cold War today, and then on Tuesday we're going to be talking about the really last years of the Soviet Union's existence, the struggles that they were going through before they ended up collapsing in the early 1990s. For ease of access, I put all of it onto just one slide deck, so it's all in the same place and easier to find. So let's get going here. This is the lecture overview. So if you haven't already copied it down, now would be a good time to do that so that you have a structure for your notes. Before we jump into our lecture here, I wanted to bring in this like fun, weird thing I saw on BuzzFeed the other day. Apparently in the midst of all of this like coronavirus, financial crisis stuff that's going on right now, Britney Spears has taken to social media to encourage the government to like, take care of people, to give financial aid, to share the wealth. And people kind of took that and ran with her and started making a bunch of memes where they were calling her like the queen of communism and stuff like that. And someone even took it so far as to record this incredible video, or I guess song, which is a mashup of Britney Spears and the anthem of the Soviet Union. So it is just very silly and funny and wild. I thought it was a great combination of like a current events thing, kind of, and what we're learning in the, in our content. And you can see really how all the stuff is still super relevant. So this is a resource that I made last year. It's just for you. I'm not going to go through all of these things. I know that part of the challenge of learning about the Cold War is that there's so much to remember, first of all, but also there's tons of different leaders, different American presidents, and it's tough. It can be tough to keep track of all of that. So this is supposed to help you kind of keep track of who is the American president, when, and which Soviet leader is their counterpart. And then in the middle are the different major events of the Cold War that take place during that time. So it's hopefully a little easier for you to organize the chronology piece around that and to help you understand a little better. So there's 3 slides of that. Use that as you wish. All right, so the first thing we're talking about today in the Cold War Part 2 is the Cold War in Asia, specifically starting with the Cultural Revolution in China. I had mentioned this in last time's lecture, that after the PRC is established in 1949, Mao Zedong is really interested in having a culture which is uniform and a culture which values the things that sort of the Chinese Communist Party wants it to value. So this is really undertaken by this group of young people called the Red Guard. These were young people like high school students or university students. They would have their little red books. They talk about this in Spielvogel chapter 29. It's basically like their Bible about how to be a good communist. It's essentially like a propaganda workbook. They would be dressed like actual soldiers, like almost like a National Guard. But their job was to go out into their communities and to make sure that everyone within their communities was sort of like following the cultural rules of how to be a good communist. And so that meant that people, couldn't really be religious. The Red Guard did a lot of work going into communities and taking apart churches, taking apart statues and monuments that were religious in any way and burning them, collecting books that were religious and burning them. If we're thinking about when has this happened before, you might think back to the French Revolution. Remember when Robespierre starts to get in charge and they change everything, right? They rename the Temple of Notre Dame to the Temple of Reason. They changed all the days of the week. Remember all that? So in some ways, this is kind of similar. It's playing out again, but in a communist format in China. The Red Guard go through and they destroy any items that are connected to wealth or connected to the West. So the primary source excerpt in chapter 29 that you're reading is the experience of a man who, and the Red Guard comes into his house and they take and destroy all of his ceramic plates that were expensive, because those are the idea of having wealth, personal wealth, the idea of having expensive items is not part of like the communist system. And so the Red Guard's job was essentially to make a culture that didn't value those things anymore. And in order to make a culture that doesn't value those things anymore, sometimes you like physically have to destroy them. The Red Guard also did a lot of like oppression of some people. Anyone who was sort of an intellectual, even people who just wore glasses, who were considered like potential intellectuals, were usually seen as suspicious, because they were seen as like people who were going to be not like good, loyal communists. So this video I really recommend you checking out. It's only a couple of minutes. It is from the BBC. It's someone who, as a young person, was a part of the Red Guard, and obviously BBC is interviewing him when he's much older. But he talks about his experience in the Red Guard. He talks about, what he thought that they were doing, what like the purpose of it was, and how he feels about it looking back on it. So it's really interesting, and it gives you a window into that time period. The next thing we're going to talk about for the Cold War Part 2 is the Sino-Soviet split. I also mentioned this in the lecture last time. When the PRC is established in 1949, there's a lot of basically propaganda work done to make people think that the Soviet Union and the PRC are like, they're on the same page, they're a unified front. There's tons of propaganda from this era, both Russian and Chinese, that sort of try and send this message home. So lots of images, for example, of Mao and Stalin together, kind of like leading the people into the future. This one, which is just like so weird, a Chinese soldier and a Soviet soldier with their respective sons. It like almost looks like they're like a family. They're definitely not. It's just supposed to be like, we're united together type of deal. But that was not the whole truth. For a number of reasons, there was a lot of disunity between the Chinese Communist Party and the Soviet Union. A lot of that had to do with the fact that the Chinese Communist Party did not feel that they were getting the respect that they deserved from the Soviet Union. The Chinese Communist Party had been able to achieve something that the Soviet Union had not. The PRC essentially had established a revolution from the bottom up. They had gotten a peasants' revolution to take place. They'd gotten a huge number of peasants, agricultural peasants, and workers on board with communism, and they had created a revolution that had overthrown the nationalist government of China in 1949. And this was really what Karl Marx had described in the Communist Manifesto. This is how communism should work. It should work from the bottom up. It should be a movement of the people. In the Soviet Union, that's not how it had played out. When we talked about the establishment of the Soviet Union in the early 1920s under Vladimir Lenin, his belief was that, in the context of the Soviet Union, that wasn't going to work. You had to have a top-down revolution. You needed to have a small core group of very dedicated communists lead the revolution and basically force people to follow along. And so the Soviet Union was never able to create the type of revolution that maybe Karl Marx had envisioned. So for that reason, the Chinese communists believe that they deserve a lot of respect because they were the ones who had like the truest or more pure form of communism. They pretty consistently felt like they were being disrespected by the Soviet Union. Mao Zedong visited the Soviet Union in the early 1950s when Joseph Stalin was still alive and felt that like he wasn't treated with enough, he wasn't like treated glamorously. Like he wasn't given a fancy hotel to stay in. He wanted to be treated with like he was more famous, I guess. There were other instances in which the Chinese felt sort of disrespected by the Soviet Union. For example, during the Korean War, we talked about last time how it was the Chinese who had really allowed the North Koreans to be successful to an extent in that war. The Chinese had provided troops and had provided assistance to them. Well, the Chinese had actually borrowed that money and had borrowed those military equipment from the Soviet Union. And when it came time to sort of pay them back, the Soviet Union was really strict about the Chinese paying them back. Making sure that every dime got returned to them. And so that made the Chinese feel disrespected because the Chinese communists now feel that the Soviet Union doesn't trust them, even though theoretically they should be on the same side. They're fighting for the same thing. They're fighting for the expansion of communism. So all of that is kind of brewing throughout the 1950s. And then in 1953, Stalin dies and Khrushchev comes into power. And that's when things really start to break down. Khrushchev and Mao, like on a personality level, did not really get along. There was a lot, just to do with ego, I think. There is a fabulous article from the Smithsonian that I 1,000% recommend. It's about how their relationship caused the overall alliance between the Soviet Union and the PRC to break down. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that Khrushchev couldn't swim. And I'm going to leave you with that sort of intriguing piece to encourage you to check out the article and read it on your own. So eventually, at the end of the 1950s, the break is official. The Soviet Union cuts off all foreign aid. They cut off all basically financial aid to China, and that's it. Their relationship is essentially over. Both of these political cartoons are making reference to that. Here we have Mao and Khrushchev, battling it out with the hammer and the sickle of communism. And this artist even kind of has gone so far to say that they seem to think, that China has become more powerful than the Soviet Union. It's sort of like the student has become the master type of situation. But the final nail on the coffin for the relationship between the Soviet Union and the PRC was when the People's Republic of China started opening up a new relationship with the United States. But it's only because the relationship with the PRC and the Soviet Union was so bad that China actually turned to the United States. So it's kind of one of those situations where the cause is also the effect in some regard. So because China was becoming politically isolated from the Soviet Union, they were kind of looking for an opportunity to make friends with the other big superpower in the world, which was the United States. So in the early 1970s, there was going to be a ping pong tournament, the professional name, a table tennis tournament in Beijing, and China actually invited the American team to come and play. And this is a huge deal because since 1949, when the PRC was established, Americans had not been in China. No one really knew what was going on there. They called it the bamboo curtain, just like Winston Churchill called the dividing line between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc the Iron Curtain. They called it the bamboo curtain. It was separating China from the rest of the world to an extent. So this table tennis team goes to China, and they take with them a group of photojournalists that the Chinese government had allowed in. And they take all these photos. Here's them on the cover of Time magazine on the Great Wall. And it's this huge deal because it's the first time that many Americans are seeing in these photos, what's going on, what China is like. It's been, 20, 30 years since we had broken off our relationships with them. And it's this moment that the relationship between the United States and China starts to open up. And so that's the reason why it's called ping pong diplomacy, because it was this ping pong tournament that allowed the relationship to blossom. So a couple of political cartoons for us to look at here. This is Richard Nixon. He was the American president at the time. Shortly after the ping pong tournament in 1973, he actually goes to China to visit. And it's a huge deal because he's the first American president to visit China in years and years and years. So him going to China was really the signal of the United States is opening up the relationship between us and them, that we are going to be willing to recognize them diplomatically. And so it's a huge step away from our previous policy, which was the one China policy, the policy that the only legitimate Chinese government that we were willing to recognize was the ROC, which was out in Taiwan. This is a total 180 on that. So here we have Richard Nixon. He is doing his very classic Nixon peace sign thing. That was his trademark move. And here he is playing ping pong with Mao Zedong. The details here are really fun. The ping pong net is obviously a little bamboo wall, making reference to that bamboo curtain that I mentioned earlier. And you've got this guy watching in the background who's actually keeping the score of the game. This is Zhou Enlai. He was the Chinese, basically the prime minister of China to an extent. So Mao Zedong is the head of the Chinese Communist Party, but Zhou Enlai is the person who's actually politically more in charge of China. And so here, this other cartoon is also, playing on that ping pong idea. Nixon plays ping pong here with Zhou Enlai, but there's somebody that they are bypassing as they play this game. It's this little guy standing on the table who's not quite tall enough to be, to reach the ball or to be a part of the game. And this is Chiang Kai-shek. And he was the leader of the ROC, the Republic of China, the government that was out in Taiwan. This was the government that for many years the United States had said, you're the only legitimate government of China. And now the Americans are sort of switching switching their, they're changing their tune. And so for the ROC and for Chiang Kai-shek, this was sort of a betrayal to them, because eventually they will lose the seat, the permanent seat on the Security Council at the United Nations. They will lose that seat, and it will go instead to a member of the PRC. And for that reason, actually, Taiwan is still not a member of the United Nations, because they basically felt so sort of betrayed by the Americans giving up their one China policy that they followed for so long. Just for fun, if you're interested in these things, if you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, this scene will make a lot more sense to you. If you've not seen the movie Forrest Gump, you don't really need to know anything about it, other than that it's set in the 1970s, and there's a scene where the main character, Forrest Gump, who's played by Tom Hanks, is like training for a big ping pong match in China. And it's a reference to all this. The other thing here that's fun is, back in like the 90s, I think, someone decided that Nixon's visit to China would make a great topic for an opera. So they wrote a whole opera about Nixon going to China, and it's so weird. It is so bizarre. Obviously, when Nixon really did go to China, it was like a huge publicity event. Like there's, he got off the plane, he's shaking hands with all these Chinese figures. And so they take that moment, this particular scene that I hyperlinked, I have to make sure it works, but the particular scene that I hyperlinked is that moment when Nixon first gets there and he's shaking hands with Zhou Enlai, and it's like this huge deal. It's very silly, very strange. Just check that out for fun. The last thing I'm going to talk about in this particular video is the Cold War in Vietnam. So we talked about that in the last lecture as well, the First Indochina War, which is Vietnam's essentially war for independence from its French colonizers. We know that the French had lost that war, so the Vietnamese were officially like not a colony anymore, but we also know that at the Geneva Accords, they took Vietnam and partitioned it at the 17th parallel, making the northern part of Vietnam a communist state under Ho Chi Minh, and the southern part of Vietnam a capitalist state under this guy, Ngo Dinh Diem. So pretty much what happened in Korea ends up happening in Vietnam, that North Vietnam eventually invades South Vietnam and tries to unify the two in one communist state. The United States is not happy with that. The US is particularly concerned because there is a concept that's popular in the US at this time called the domino theory. Essentially, people believed that if Vietnam fell to communism, that all of the other countries around it would fall like a row of dominoes, and that pretty soon communism would extend throughout Southeast Asia or all of Asia. And so this directly, goes against the United States' whole foreign policy, which is containment. So the United States looks for ways to support South Vietnam against the North Vietnamese. At first, the United States is just supporting financially. By 1960, the US had sent $1 billion to Ngo Dinh Diem's government to help kind of stabilize it, to stabilize the South Vietnamese economy, and to improve the South Vietnamese military. But this was not proving to be enough. So eventually, in the mid-1960s, the United States ended up sending a significant amount of American troops there. In 1968 alone, there were over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. So this is what we would call the Vietnam War, but is also called the Second Indochina War. And it's very controversial in the United States and in other parts of the world, because the United States was trying to support South Vietnam, but the South Vietnamese government wasn't that good. It was pretty corrupt. There were a lot of issues around the bombing campaigns that the United States was running. And eventually people sort of, the war lost support from the Americans because it was costing a lot of money. It ends up costing $1 trillion and 60,000 American lives. And so the United States withdraws from Vietnam by 1973. And within 2 years of that withdrawal, the whole of Vietnam fell to communism. So it's also controversial for that reason, because we didn't really get what we wanted. We spent all of this time and money and lives into this war, and then it was unsuccessful in the end. So that is another big conflict. It's probably one of the most famous conflicts of the Cold War. Obviously, we supported the South Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese were supported somewhat by the Soviet Union, but also by China. So it's that classic example of a proxy war. Our people fight their people, or in this sense, we fight their people. Where the next topic we're going to talk about is the sort of all the repression that's going on in Eastern Europe. But I'm going to stop there, and I'll make that into a separate video. So go and find that one after this. IMS.